Now, from the University of Virginia Center for Politics.
Good evening and welcome to our first anniversary show on the January 6th insurrection. We're broadcasting from the Rotunda, the dome room of the Rotunda at the University of Virginia, which of course was founded by Thomas Jefferson. As anniversaries go, though, this is not one that anyone should be particularly proud of. A year ago today, as the insurrection was gaining steam and raging on Capitol Hill, we gathered here at UVA's Rotunda to talk about the state of democracy and how we might find ways to get along with one another. If anyone needed any proof that conditions were deteriorating in our country, January 6th last year proved it in a horrifying way. Urged on by the outgoing president, President Trump, who didn't want to vacate the White House and pushed a completely made-up lie about a supposed stolen election, a mob of zealous Trump rally attendees headed toward the Capitol to overturn the results of a presidential election. It's still hard to believe that the insurrection happened. Yet if our republic is to survive, our democracy is to survive, then it is something we must never forget. So that's why we're here tonight. And over the course of the next hour and a half, we'll be joined by TV and print journalists who were on the ground at the time of the insurrection. We'll also be joined by Congresswoman Liz Cheney, who has distinguished herself by standing up during the January 6th investigation, the committee, and she is also serving as vice chair of that committee. We'll also be joined by Senator Tim Kaine, who was in the Capitol and was rushed to a safe room by security. In fact, he was going to join us a year ago, but they took away his cell phone when they put him in the secure room. Well, he's got one tonight, I'm delighted to say, and he's not driving either. There are others who are going to join us, including Mary Trump, the niece of former President Donald Trump, who's well qualified to address the subject. And we'll also bring you the results of several ongoing and very interesting research efforts aimed at trying to understand the deep divide in America so that we can bridge the deep divide in America. If we don't do that, January 6th will happen again in some form, some destabilizing form. And the effort to organize what amounted to an attempted coup d'etat could easily be repeated. Perhaps successful next time, which is what we most of all want to prevent. So welcome to our program. We've entitled it The Shock of January 6th. Now let's get started. My first guest is a well-known TV anchor and an old friend, Jim Acosta, who is CNN's chief domestic correspondent based in Washington, D.C. Previously, Jim served as CNN's chief White House correspondent, where he covered the Trump administration and the Obama administration from the White House and around the world. He also was at a number of Trump rallies, sometimes was made the target at those Trump rallies. But he's a stand-up guy, never took the bait. And Jim, we highly respect you. We thank you for joining us on a very busy day. I've got a question to start off with. As you know, earlier today, Donald Trump was supposed to have a press conference, but he canceled that. It was down at Mar-a-Lago. At another time, though, Trump said that the insurrection was full of love. That was the phrase that he used. And he insisted for more than a year with absolutely zero evidence, nada, zero evidence, that fraud had occurred in the 2020 presidential election. Somehow it was stolen from him. It's another case, really, of Trump saying to all of us, who are you going to believe, me or your lying eyes? We've all seen the films of Capitol and D.C. police being beaten by flagpoles, insurrectionists smashing their way into the House and Senate chambers. Of course, 5 people died and 140 officers were hurt, and hundreds were arrested for their participation in the violence that was sparked by Trump himself. You have watched all this firsthand, up close. What's your reaction to how Trump has handled this? Why did he cancel the press conference today? And will there be any change going forward?
Well, Larry, I think that's a very good question. First of all, thanks for having me. It's an honor to be here with everybody at the University of Virginia and the other terrific guests that you have scheduled for the program. I think in terms of why Donald Trump canceled his press conference today, I think it can probably be explained in, I guess, one sentence, and that is he's a loser. He is somebody who knows deep down that he lost the 2020 election, and he didn't want to go up against the president of the United States today. He knows all too well that Joe Biden had the bully pulpit today, that he was going to get all of the television coverage, and that Donald Trump was not going to get a lot of television coverage. He might have gotten live coverage over on Fox and on Newsmax and OAN and in the conservative media ecosystem, but the major networks were not going to take his lies live on the air. That just wasn't going to happen. And so I think to some extent he was making a television decision, which always guides, much of what he does. The other thing, Larry, I think that is going on here is, we've reached a very serious moment in this country. The country is at a crossroads. Are we going to believe the truth or are we going to believe lies? And Donald Trump has convinced, 30 to 40% of the country to believe his lies. And, one of the things I'm sure you'll be pursuing throughout this evening is how do we solve that riddle? How do we crack the code and get the 30 to 40% of the American people who are believing Trump's lies to come back to the real world? And until we do that, until we figure out that special sauce to get those folks to do that, we're in a whole lot of trouble in this country. And folks like myself, the other journalists who are joining you this evening, we face a difficult task. And I'm sure we'll get into some of these areas, but one of the questions that I've been wrestling with is how do we go about talking about what we do over the next couple of years between now and the 2024 election? I think as journalists, we have to be pro-democracy. We can't both sides democracy. We can't both sides the truth and what happened in the 2020 election and what happened on January 6th. You mentioned the rallies, and just very briefly, one of the reasons why I covered the rallies was because I was seeing up close and personal this cancerous, toxic effect that Trump was having on a large segment of American society. People were believing his lies long before January 6th, and they were being whipped up by his violent rhetoric long before January 6th. And so when that spasm of violence occurred on January the 6th, I was shocked but not surprised, because I had seen the buildup to this over and over and over again as he, I think put out sort of a call to violence throughout his presidency. He was always demonizing the press, demonizing minorities, demonizing immigrants, demonizing Democratic leaders, members of Congress, and so on. He was always flirting with violence throughout his presidency. And so, when we talk about January 6th, when we talk about, what was motivating him today and why he decided not to hold that news conference, I think we have to come to grips with a very, very important truth, and that he is a deeply disturbed person. And unfortunately, he has managed to pull the wool over the eyes of so many millions of American people that they don't see that. And it's our job, it's our task as journalists from here on out to try to continue to get through to those folks. It's really all we can do at this point.
Is there any way that you see, Jim, to present the real facts to these folks? And you've had a lot of contact with them. I still remember some of the rallies where they would throw things and boo you, but then during breaks in the program, they would come over and ask for photos and autographs. So, part of them is not as hostile as what we saw on January 6th. Can they be reached, or is it that they only watch Fox or some of those other conservative outlets and they have no counter information?
They can be reached, Larry. That is another one of the reasons why I went to the rallies. A lot of times they would say, "Hey, Jim, can you come over here and talk to me for a minute?" And I would hop down off of my live position to go up and talk to folks. And a lot of times, like as you were saying, Larry, sometimes they wanted a selfie, sometimes they wanted to give me the middle finger. And as I like to joke to many of them, make sure you get the selfie first, because if you get it the other way around, you might not get your selfie. But kidding aside, I would get into conversations with many of them, and sometimes they just needed to hear it from me, person to person, and say, okay, Jim's not such a bad guy. Maybe I will think about what he had to say. And one of the things I've been doing with my show on the weekends that I now anchor on CNN is I do these what we call step backs, which are really kind of old school commentaries. People will say, well, you're not supposed to be opinionated. You're not supposed to offer your observations and so on. Well, anchors have been actually doing this for many, many years. You're supposed to tell people what they need to know, not what they want to know. And I've been trying to, in my own style, in my own way, try to get the truth across to many of those Trump supporters. And I do it in sort of a colorful way. But I'm hoping that, and I know that they're listening and they're watching, because it gets picked up on Fox and in conservative media and so on. It may aggravate them and make them red in the face and want to stomp their feet. But I do think that if the news can be done, if the truth can be told in a penetrating way, I do believe we can get through that, that Trump fog that he puts out there, get past those jamming radars that are mounted atop Fox News in Midtown Manhattan, where it certainly seems that way sometimes. We can't stop trying, Larry. One of the things I used to tell my colleagues when I was in the White House before Trump left office, people would ask me, well, how are we going to get out of this? What are we going to do? And my comment was always, we just have to outlast him. We just have to outlast him, and we will. Be confident that we will. It's going to be tough. We may not have seen the last of political violence in this country, but there are too many good, decent people in the United States who believe in the truth, who understand the truth, and I believe that will carry the day at the end of all of this.
Well, I hope your optimism is justified. Some days I feel that way, and other days I don't. Jim, you're absolutely right about reporters expressing themselves. Walter Cronkite told us the truth at last about Vietnam in early 1968. I remember watching it live, and it was very important for the country to hear that. I have noticed, though, not just on your program, which I watch, and you're very blunt, you're very direct. You will say that's not true. What you just had in that report that Donald Trump or some other politician said, that's not true. But I think all of us, and certainly you being at the heart of CNN, we've seen a big change in CNN, because CNN used to be an on the one hand and then on the other hand network, understandably, when you had other sorts of people in charge of the Republican Party. How did that change happen? Was there an email from the top, or was there a meeting of everybody at CNN? How did this happen? Because it's much better, frankly. That's my opinion anyway.
Well, I appreciate that, Larry, and the check is in the mail. No, I'm just kidding. There was no meeting or memo that said, this is how we need to cover things. I know for a fact, because I was the lead White House correspondent throughout the Trump presidency, my sense of it is that we had to call lies lies. And, we couldn't, pussyfoot around or tiptoe through the tulips when it came to Trump's racism. The way he was playing footsie with white nationalists. I'll tell you an example, and you and I have talked about this before, Larry, but after Charlottesville, when he had that infamous press conference at Trump Tower, I was the one who said to him, there are no fine people in the Nazis. I asked the question that led to him saying there are very fine people on both sides, and I said to him, there are no fine people in the Nazis. And, it's on tape, it's in the transcript, you can go back, you can look at it. And, at that moment, I didn't think it would be right to say, well, hold on a second, how can you say there are very fine people on both sides? On the one hand, maybe there are people on the other side who are just fine and dandy, and maybe they're not. That just doesn't work anymore. We can't be neutral in the face of outright racism coming from the President of the United States, outright lies coming from the President of the United States. And I think it was an evolution over time, Larry, and it wasn't just inside CNN, it was at other news organizations. And I think maybe CNN was perhaps ahead of other news organizations in this regard. And perhaps that is why we were so successful, I think, in covering the Trump presidency. Not from a rating standpoint, but I think in public confidence, people having confidence in how we were reporting about the Trump presidency. Because we, I think, got to a point where we said we can't both sides the truth. We can't both sides somebody who is obviously diametrically opposed to the democratic way of life here in the United States. I think that's been demonstrated, pretty, in a pretty crystal clear fashion by Donald Trump up until now. He refers to the November 3rd election as the insurrection and so on. It's such garbage. It's terrible lies, and it has a toxic effect on the American people. And so we just have to call them like we see them, Larry. As Walter Cronkite, and I'm glad you mentioned Walter Cronkite. That is an example I give to people when I have discussions like this. Walter Cronkite went to Vietnam. He was the most trusted man in America, came back from Vietnam and said the war in Vietnam cannot be won. And as you know, Larry, because you know this better than me, Lyndon Johnson said to his top aides, well, if I've lost Cronkite, I've lost America. And so we just have to keep telling the truth. That doesn't mean I'm Walter Cronkite or any of us are Walter Cronkite. I'm not putting myself or us on that pedestal, but we do have to, I think, follow that example if we want to get through this.
Jim, I think that's a terrific answer. I want to ask you briefly, because we've only got 2 minutes left, and talking to an anchor, it's great, because when I say 2 minutes, you know exactly what I mean. You go through that every week. Where do you see the January 6th investigation in the House, and also perhaps the Justice Department, which until yesterday, with Merrick Garland, has been awfully quiet? What is happening, do you think? And where's it headed in the 1 year they've got left before probably the Republicans take over the House of Representatives?
Well, I do know, because I talked to, and I reported this today, I talked to a former Trump White House official who has spoken with the January 6th committee and told that committee that on January 6th, as the violence was unfolding at the Capitol, Trump put out a tweet at 2:38 p.m. that afternoon and did not want to say the words "stay peaceful." Those words ended up being in his tweet only after Ivanka Trump, Mark Meadows, and others were leaning on him, urging him to do that. But initially, he was telling his top aides he didn't want to say the words "stay peaceful," according to this former White House official I spoke with, who has spoken with the January 6th committee. I only mention that because there are other former Trump administration officials who are talking to the committee. That is something that we have verified. And I think the January 6th committee is going to have and present to the American people a very, very clear, full picture of what occurred on January 6th and in the weeks leading up to January 6th. But Larry, putting that to the side for just a moment, and as I'm running out of time, let me just say, we already know that Donald Trump, and I said this on television earlier today, so I'm not saying anything differently to you. Donald Trump stabbed America in the back on January 6th. That is what he did. And in the weeks leading up to that, he repeatedly did that. He went to the Secretary of State in Georgia and said, I want to find 11,000 votes. He tried to conspire to commit election fraud with the top election official in the state of Georgia. He and other members of his cabal were calling other election officials around the country to see if they could gin up, if they could somehow put together a scheme to steal the election in the House of Representatives when Mike Pence was going to certify the vote. And so I think in getting to what Merrick Garland is up to over at the Department of Justice, I think they face a very critical question, and that is whether or not to charge the former president of the United States with the crime of election fraud, or at the very least attempting to interfere with an official action of Congress, which is something else that you've heard Liz Cheney talk about in her comments that she's talked about publicly. And so, the January 6th committee is going to do its work. They're going to put out their findings. The American people, we're going to have a full picture of what occurred on January 6th and leading up to January 6th. But there is such an important moment that's coming, and that is what the Attorney General of the United States ultimately decides to do. And Larry, you know all too well, Watergate, Vietnam, there are moments that happen in the history of this country where the actions of a president of the United States approach and cross the line of criminality. And we have to decide as Americans, are we a country of laws? Are we a country of accountability? And if Donald Trump is allowed to get away with what occurred in the lead up to January 6th and on January 6th, I think we're in a great deal of trouble. And I think that has to be weighing on Merrick Garland's mind right now.
Amen, Jim. Amen to everything you said. And we appreciate your time. It's a great start to our program. And I would simply say, good luck. Good luck in fighting the good fight. And fighting the good fight means seeking the truth. And that's what your profession does. Thanks so much, Jim. Excellent.
You got it. We're going to do it. Thank you.
We'll see you soon, I hope. Thanks a lot.
Sounds good.
All right, next we have three guests who have been very outspoken in their views on the Capitol insurrection. First, Mary Trump is a best-selling author and the niece of Donald Trump. Don't prejudge her. Her first book, Too Much and Never Enough, which was very interesting, has sold over 1.35 million copies. That's a few more than all my books put together, Mary. I just want you to know that. Mary earned a bachelor's and master's in English literature from Tufts University and Columbia University, respectively. And this is fascinating. Then completed a master's degree and PhD in clinical psychology at Adelphi University, later contributing to a 2002 book about schizophrenia. That came in handy, I guess. Her second book, which is focused on her uncle, is entitled The Reckoning. It is available on Amazon and every major online and storefront bookstore. And if you haven't read it, you need to do it right now. Go to Amazon. She has a new podcast called The Mary Trump Show and a newsletter titled The Good in Us. Tara Setmeyer is a resident scholar at the UVA Center for Politics here in Charlottesville and a senior advisor to the Lincoln Project. She has a podcast called Honestly Speaking with Tara Setmeyer. Tara has served on the Hill as a Republican communications director, and she serves as a CNN political commentator and is also an ABC News political contributor. And then an old friend and a UVA graduate, I have to add, Jamel Bowie, lives right here in Charlottesville. He's also a resident scholar at the Center for Politics. Jamel is a must-read columnist for the New York Times and a political analyst for CBS News, where he covers history and politics. Prior to the Times, Jamel was chief political correspondent for Slate magazine. In attending the University of Virginia, he guaranteed his success at all these organizations, and he graduated with a degree in political and social thought as well as government. What a great combination. So welcome to the three of you. Thank you so much for spending time with us. My gosh, where do we start? So much today, so much a year ago, and so much coming in the next year. Mary, since this is the first time you're joining us, I want to start with you. What was the first thing that came to mind when you saw followers of your uncle storming the Capitol 1 year ago today?
Larry, first of all, thanks so much for having me. It's an honor to be here, especially with Tara and Jamel. I had to be completely honest. When I first saw the events unfolding last year, it was very difficult to understand what was going on. I could only see what was happening outside. The first word that sprang to mind was tawdry, which is a word I associate with Donald. It just seemed like a completely chaotic, disrespectful mob of people who were milling about, because of course it took a while for us to put the pieces together. And then when it became clear just how dangerous the situation was, I honestly have to say that I believe that Donald was completely happy with how events were unfolding. The only thing that disappointed him is that it didn't go farther.
In other words, that there wasn't a complete coup d'etat that followed it, I'm sure. You know,
Yeah.
you know your uncle's psychology so well. He did cancel that press conference today, but then he sent out a statement, and many of his supporters and aides sent out these blistering statements as well. Is there nothing that will ever change his direction on any of this? Some of the people around him apparently dissuaded him from having a press conference. I can't remember him ever backing down on anything. Is that a hint that he may be listening more carefully to at least some of the people around him, or is it hopeless?
It's completely hopeless. The only reason he canceled today, I'm assuming would be the same reason he put out a video statement a year ago, because he was convinced by somebody in his inner circle that to fail to do so would expose him to legal jeopardy. That's probably the only argument that would sway him, because psychologically he is incapable of changing course. He cannot accept the reality of this situation. And I think as we see his written statements coming out over the last few months, they're getting increasingly less cogent. Not that he's ever been really cogent to begin with, but there is a definite worsening, I think, of his state of mind. And that just suggests that nobody down the road is going to be able to rein him in at all to the extent that they do now.
You know, he seems to me, and you're the judge of his psychology, which is why I'm asking, but he seems to me to have learned a lot about how to steal an election. That if he's given the opportunity the next time, he will do it much better. The first thing I want to know from you is, do you think that he is really intending to run? And if he is, what could change his mind other than a very serious health problem?
Yeah, I'll start with the second question first, simply because I think it is to our undying shame that is a question, will he run, that is still a question we need to ask. The real question should have been, why is he being allowed to? But here we are, and he may have the opportunity to make that decision, which is an appalling stain on the political process, honestly, and on the Republican Party in particular. As to his learning how to steal an election effectively, and is he planning to do it again, I would say that it's not so much that he planned to steal it as that he refused to believe that he lost it. And if you combine that with the fact that he is perfectly capable of lying as easily as he breathes, then this is somebody who's willing to stop at nothing to protect his fragile ego. What makes this more dangerous now is that almost every single elected Republican will help him in those efforts. And I don't think it's that we have to worry necessarily that there will be a coup. It's more that we have to worry that the Republicans are going to rig the system even farther in their favor so that they'll be able to steal the next election legitimately, if you will.
And since they're going to be setting the rules if they take over the House and the Senate and key positions in the states like Secretary of State, they can set the rules or revise the rules or make up new rules, and then they can say, you can't change the rules in the middle of the game. We have to follow these rules. So it's a real threat, no question about it. I'm interested to hear you say that he really believes that the election was stolen, which no one who looks at the complete absence of evidence that it was stolen can actually believe, but he believes it. Let me bring Tara and Jamel into this discussion as well. And let's look back to January 6th, a year ago, and then try to project forward. What do we need to do, in your opinion, what do we need to do to make sure that we stop a future January 6th or some other coup d'etat in a future election year? What? Give me 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 99 and 100. I don't know. Tell me whatever you think is true. Go, either one of you.
I guess I'll start. So on sort of an immediate level, right, you can imagine, and this has been discussed, reforms to the Electoral Count Act to sort of clarify the role of the vice president in counting electoral votes, clarifying mainly that they're just there to count electoral votes, nothing else. You can imagine, voting rights legislation to standardize election procedures and protect the right to vote in states. You can imagine an end to partisan gerrymandering to kind of maybe begin to break the hold on some of these hyper-gerrymandered state legislatures that Republicans are using to pursue some of these aims. You do have these short-term measures, but I think that the problem and the issue is that the chief obstacles to sort of moving to a different course are in part structural in terms of American democracy and then institutional in terms of the Republican Party. The structural problems are simply that the ability to win power without winning the majority of votes, I think, has created a reliance on that method of winning among Republicans. And so knowing that you can win without winning the popular vote, knowing you can win the presidency without that, knowing you can win the Senate without winning a majority of votes in Senate elections nationwide, I think has encouraged and helped create the attitude that you really don't need to, you really shouldn't have to. And that when you combine that as well with an institutional Republican Party that has come to believe that it's sort of demographically doomed, that change in the demographics of the United States is going to make it impossible for it to win, then you have the sort of, excuse me, my dog is currently yelling at me, so if that's what you hear, that's what's happening.
That's good.
You have this mix of forces which are pushing the Republican Party in this direction and encouraging and acting in sort of this toxic interaction with the personality of Donald Trump. I think if you remove one of those things, right, if Republicans were convinced they could just win elections without having to, change the rules or rely on counter-majoritarian institutions, if Republicans had won the previous elections with straightforward popular votes, or if Donald Trump didn't exist, we'd be in like a better place. But the combination of those three things, I think, is almost like an irrepressible force pushing many Republicans to this place where if they aren't if they aren't looking the other way from January 6th's fallout, then they're actively, assisting the effort to legally attain the same outcome.
This last point you made reflects the fact that Republicans are well aware that only once since 1992 have they won the popular vote, which was in 2004. They've lost the popular vote every other presidential election from 1992 to 2020. Trump realizes that's his greatest advantage. If he wins it again, I'm worried that the Electoral College should just be renamed Trump University. We'll move it up from a college to a university. And that's a basic problem with our system. And Jamel, you've written about the need for a number of constitutional, not just legislative solutions to our problems. And there's no chance of it with the red versus blue and the current rules for getting constitutional amendments. It's tragic. Tara, I want to salute you for your courage. You've been a Republican. You've tried to work within the Republican Party. You have worked within the Republican Party and been successful at it. But Donald Trump was just too much to swallow. I think that's fair enough to say. And you have, instead of doing what so many Republicans did, which is stay silent or take a vacation, a long one, you spoke out. You said what you believed. Is there really any hope for the Republican Party to move back and become a mainstream political party, a moderate conservative or even a mainstream conservative party, and get rid of this craziness, much of which, not all of which, but much of which was brought in by Trump?
Larry, I don't think that it's hopeful in the near future, which is why I made the decision to leave the party after the election. And to be honest, what pushed me out of the party wasn't necessarily Donald Trump. It was the enablers and the people in the party who should have known better, who should have been the guardrails against someone like Donald Trump, who decided to acquiesce and do the politically craven thing and decide that they were going to hitch their wagon to the Trump train because he was gaining momentum and that's how they would stay in power. To Jamel's point, we all know in Political Science 101 that elected officials, their number one goal is they're single seekers of re-election. But at some point, your moral compass has to come in where you say, wait a minute, I'm not willing to do that or go that far just to maintain power. Well, we've seen that bar has gotten considerably lower and lower and lower every time we thought that it couldn't get any worse, or there's no way the Republican leadership would allow that or this. And we found out not only would they allow that or this, they would allow a whole lot more and enable it in order to just to stay in power. I decided to leave the party after 27 years after the election last year. I stayed a Republican throughout the tenure of Donald Trump's presidency with the hope that Republicans would snap out of this, if there would be an electoral repudiation of Trumpism, that the Republican leadership and those who were too cowardly to speak up would finally get the spine and say, all right, he's out of power now. We can kind of go back to being establishment Republicans, and we can argue over capital gains taxes and, you know, the role of government and things like that, traditional policy initiatives. And that didn't happen. And when I knew that the Republican Party was unsalvageable was the night that Trump lost, and the election, although it was too close to call, but it looked like he was going to lose. He went into the East Wing of the White House and claimed voter fraud and refused to concede. That wasn't surprising. What concerned me and what was the final straw was when Republican leadership did not tell him to stop it. The fact that Mitch McConnell and Kevin McCarthy and the handful of others in the Republican Party who should have said, I'm sorry, but now we're getting into a constitutional issue. This is wrong. We don't do this in America. There's a peaceful transition of power here. You lost, that's the end of it. They didn't do that. And so that was it for me, because it became a constitutional issue now. The fundamentals of our country are the free and fair elections, the administering of that, and the peaceful transition of power. And then obviously January 6th was just something that was unspeakable, but not shocking in that we saw the slow walk to violence. Trump was continually pushing these narratives. He was ginning these people up, and it was shocking, to say the least. I mean, I worked 7 years up in Capitol Hill. It was, I still get very emotional thinking about it, to be honest. But if you do not have consequences for that action, then it's just a practice run. And we have a Republican Party that has decided to whitewash history and turn around and try to convince people that we didn't see what we saw. You know, it was Voltaire who said, those that can get you to believe absurdities can get you to commit atrocities. And that's what we're seeing with this ecosystem of propaganda and disinformation and misinformation coming out of the Republicans and their right-wing ecosystem, which is a toxic mix. So I fear for what happens in the future if the Republicans are not repudiated and if they're not denied power. That's the only way that they'll course correct.
Tara, I think you're right, and they've shown no real sign of accepting the reality that we've all learned very, very painfully, and they should have learned, and I think they actually did, but then they found there was a political price, so they went scurrying down to Mar-a-Lago to kiss the ring or something else. It's really disturbing. We're in a strong, vibrant democracy. It used to be a strong, vibrant democracy, and you can't really have that without two functioning parties that can compete. Let me wrap up here, and I wish we had more time, but unfortunately we don't. I'm going to ask both Mary and Jamel very briefly. We are hearing for the first time people say the solution might be secession, which I assume would involve another civil war. I don't know how you do it peacefully. It's completely impractical. You can't take the red people out of the blue states and the blue people out of the red states unless you spend trillions. And what about the nuclear weapons? How do you divide them up? It's not like children in a divorce. What would you say if people said to you, whether Republicans or Democrats, I don't see any way for us to get along together? Mary, start us off, and then Jamel. Yes.
Yeah, we don't have a choice. I mean, I agree. It's very difficult right now to have any patience with people who are pro-insurrection and anti-democratic, counter-majoritarian, pro-autocrats who don't seem to believe in democracy anymore. However, a lot of people who voted for Donald in 2020 aren't those people. They're low information voters, they're knee-jerk Republicans, what have you. They're too busy to pay attention. They're not laser focused the way many of us are. You know, these are people who can be educated. These are people who've been lied to. We need to remember that they have been lied to by the leaders they have put their trust in. And we cannot blame them for that. So first thing we need to do is make sure the Democrats hold on to the House and the Senate in 2022. And then we need to start reaching out and rebuilding the fabric of this country, because there is no other solution. Either we do that or we lose the American experiment, I think, permanently.
And that's the great fear we all have, no question about it. Jamel, what's your view on this?
I agree with you that the idea that the United States, there'd be secession along partisan lines just doesn't really make any practical sense. The difficult question, I'll say this, it is not novel, right, that the United States, that Americans have these stark divisions that are, if not irreconcilable, then close to it. That's not a new thing. And the United States has been able to truck along just fine with that being the case. It's also not particularly novel that there would be these, intense passions and disagreements, even about the value of democracy, of really specifically political equality, right? The idea that we all count equally within the polity. What's novel is sort of the nationalization of politics, of media, of American culture, right? That in the past, you could kind of escape it, right? You could find your little enclave and not have to worry about it. And now there is, I think, a sense that whichever side wins is going to sort of dominate the national culture in a way that makes it inescapable. And I'm not entirely sure what one does about that. And it's possible that this is just going to be all of this, whatever this is just something we're going to have to work through and push through an attempt to maintain electoral democracy as much as we can. But one thing I think it's important to say is that the electoral democracy that most of us have lived with and grown up with is pretty new, right? It stems from the 1960s, where most Americans have some basic baseline measure of political equality. And there's no guarantee that that's going to maintain. And we could very well go back to something much more like the electoral democracy we had before that. So that's just sort of the thought I would leave folks with, that the possible places aren't necessarily some jackbooted autocracy, but something much like the past, which was democratic for some people and not so much for others.
Well, that's disturbing on its own. That alternative disturbs me as much as the one I proposed to you. Tara, Mary, Jamel, you were fantastic. We could have devoted the entire show to you, and I hope we can have you all back at some point to have a more thorough discussion. I apologize that it wasn't longer, but we fit a lot into this hour and a half, and our viewers are expecting it. Thank you so much for spending the time with us on a very important, disturbing day. Have a good evening.
Thank you, Larry.
Thank you.
All right, next, we are going to call upon Dr. Mick McWilliams and Dr. Larry Shack. They are co-founders of Project Homefire, a new initiative dedicated to finding common ground in American politics. They're working with the UVA Center for Politics to explore and address the political, social, and psychological divides in the American electorate, and there are a lot of them. Larry, who I know quite well, earned his PhD in Government and Foreign Affairs from the University of Virginia, and he's a former distinguished graduate student here and was actually the head TA in one of my courses for many years. He serves as Chief Business Strategist at Predictive Branding Partners. Prior to that, he held senior positions at Microsoft and a number of other organizations. Mick earned his PhD in sociology with emphasis on behavioral science research methodologies, and he did it from Virginia Tech, so we're unifying Virginia here, Virginia plus Virginia Tech. He serves as the chief data scientist at Predictive Branding Partners. They have new information, which they're going to share with us, about their 2021 foundational research project analyzing data from 1,000 Trump voters and 1,000 Biden voters questioned over this past summer. Not a quick flash poll. something that was very thorough, very carefully done, and included a pretty large sample, evenly divided between Trump and Biden. Larry and Mick, I'm thrilled to have you here, and I'm going to turn it over to you, and I want to hear what you have to offer us. And Larry, I want to say to you, I hope you and your family are completely recovered from COVID.
Thank you, Larry. I appreciate it. It's been, I have 5 young kids, as Larry knows, and it's been a journey, but we're where we need to be. Thank you.
Wonderful. Tell us the new information that you have.
So can you see the screen?
Yes.
All right. So what we're going to do tonight is go through the Project Homefire data to understand better in the context of the event that Larry and others have set up, the why behind what happened on January 6th of 2021, as well as the very different views that Biden and Trump voters have of these events, and then get into some thoughts and offer up some thoughts to how to jumpstart what really is the hard work that's necessary if we want to prevent this from happening again. So with that as an introduction, you see 4 key findings that we're going to go into here. I'll go to that first one. Voters are at crisis stage. So in our work to date, Larry, we've detailed how persuasion and compromise have given way to conflict and confrontation. Political estrangement, and in some ways outright hostility towards the other side is unfortunately, for many, our new normal. Looking at some of the illustrative data that we have on the left side of this slide, you see 8 in 10 voters who view the other side's elected officials and those who support them as a clear and present danger to American democracy. On the right-hand side, again, 8 in 10 say the other side's assorted media outlets of choice have become so untruthful that they should be censored. And probably most concerning in the middle, we have 9 in 10 of both Biden and Trump voters who fear they will no longer belong in America if the other side has its way. So overall, what these findings confirm, again, with other stuff that we've published, is that the level of distrust and fear of the other side that exists in our nation right now is unprecedented, and it will not be easily solved. Building on that and going to the second finding, racial and ethnic politics have reached their breaking point. Race, ethnicity, and immigration frankly serve as the fulcrum around which our national divide pivots. Again, looking at some data, on the one hand, Biden voters tend to see social and racial justice issues as a work in progress. They continue to view systemic racism in America as a serious problem. They see whites as advantaged over immigrants and other people of color. They believe strongly there's much more the country needs to do to confront violence and racism in America. The views on the other side could not be more distinct. Trump voters tend to see a country that has tipped too far towards disadvantaging whites. They see immigration as a pervasive problem that threatens them culturally, socially, personally, and economically. They push back on the idea that there's more social and racial justice work to do. So if you think about this in the context of the previous finding, more so than just fearful of the other side, here we clearly see how the issues of violence and racism in America animate feelings on the left and the right, that the other side presents as a threat to them, their family, their friends, and affect their way of life. The commitment to democracy. Racial and ethnic politics are not alone in fueling our national conflict. Class differences, exacerbated by the growing chasm between the working middle class and the top 1% of Americans, have shattered this notion that America is truly a representative democracy. Illustrating on the left, we have this piece of data. Fully 2/3 of Biden and Trump voters say America is less a representative democracy and more a system that is run by and rigged for the benefits of the wealthy. With political credibility and legitimacy obviously lagging based on that data point, it's not surprising that voters on the left and the right express openness to taking things in their own hand to stop the other side. Openness to authoritarian impulses like empowering the president to act, or I should say empowering their president to act unilaterally, and openness to the idea of a national divorce with red states and blue states in effect separating from the republic. So this heightened levels of political estrangement that we see in the data, the fear of the other side that we see in the data, couple that with this growing polarization on the issues of race and violence, lead us to a very hard truth, which is that substantial numbers of voters are content with flirting with authoritarian impulses and endorsing actions that violate our long-standing democratic principles and norms. Now, as with most topics that we've reported on over the last few months, Biden and Trump voters differ sharply about the events of January 6th. We need to look no further than back to those events to understand what the phrase violating anti-democratic principles can look like in real life and in real time. And I think looking forward, and what should be really concerning to everybody when you look at this slide, is that while 70% of voters overall, including 90% of Biden voters and 48% of Trump voters, almost half of those, say those who occupied the US Capitol were mostly violent insurgents trying to overthrow valid election results who should be prosecuted. With that said, looking to the left-hand side of this slide, almost 1/3 of voters overall, including slightly more than half of the almost 75 million voters who voted for Donald Trump, they'd say these same people are patriots trying to right the wrong of the 2020 presidential election being unfairly stolen from Donald Trump, and who should be applauded for the actions of January 6th, 2021. Now, one of the things we wanted to do with this presentation in the context of the events tonight is dig a little bit deeper. We wanted to shed some light on the why behind the numbers. I know there's a lot of words on this slide. I won't bother trying to read them. What I can say is when we ran the analysis, it presented a very clear and sobering finding that Donald Trump and his enablers had convinced far too many Americans that the real insurrection occurred on November 3rd, 2020, that the presidency was stolen from them, that they are losing ground and losing their country because of the actions of others, that the American government is undemocratic and corrupt beyond repair, and that politically motivated violence is acceptable. More specifically, if you look at the words over on the right-hand side of this slide, on the one hand, rejection of the big lie, a desire to do more to address issues of racism and violence in America, support for expanding voting rights access, and belief in the idea that government should and can work for people emerge as the most powerful predictors of voters seeing the events of January 6th as instigated by insurgents. Over on the left, belief in conspiracy theories, a fear of the other mindset, support for secession, and openness to using violence to stop the other side from getting their way. These are the things that are most powerfully predictive of those voters who say the people who stormed the US Capitol were patriots and should be applauded. This, what we've called this patriots versus insurgents divide, reveals in the starkest terms yet that we are a nation deeply and dangerously divided. Today, literally tens of millions of Americans believe that our democracy is corrupt, that the 2020 election was stolen through election fraud and voting manipulation, and that violence in pursuit of political ends, more than just acceptable, is to be applauded. Clearly, when you think about everything in total, this poses a real threat to the future of our democracy. Now, we don't want to end on a low note. We want to end on a high note. And what we can say is that while the threat is very real, through the work with the Center for Politics and through the work with Project Homefire, we know that there is an opportunity to change course. In our work to date, what we have identified is that there are 40 million Biden and Trump voters combined who choose persuasion and compromise over conflict and confrontation, who embrace the idea that government can and should work for people, who want government to proactively address issues that polarize our politics, who see conflict, obstructionism, and a willingness to prioritize power and position over doing the work of the people they serve as a very bad thing. The opportunity, as we see it, is to pursue a series of strategies and tactics for engaging these, again, more than 40 million voters, what we call a bridging population, and to engage them directly so that we can work together to show how realizing the promise and potential of our democracy needs to start with a very simple idea. That being that solutions that incorporate the perspectives of both sides can be better than those that come from only their side. To build a bridge, if you will, through this bridging population to a better tomorrow, starting today. So I think in closing, what we have uncovered is that January 6th in many ways presents what is the central, defining, and most important problem that faces us now. And how we respond as a country, as a nation, as a people, as elected officials, how we respond will decide whether those on the side of protecting, preserving, and expanding American democracy, whether they can muster the same energy and resolve as those intent on tearing it down. And that ultimately will determine whether as a society, we can figure out how to move forward on our shared values and our long history together or not. So Larry, that's the update from Project Homefire, looking, in a sense, looking back to look forward and offer up some thoughts on how we got there, why it's obviously very, very important that we look to take steps to avoid going there again and having it repeat itself, and to offer up some thoughts on how to move forward and how to move forward together.
Larry and Mick, I think you all have done some fantastic research. We've been proud and honored at the Center for Politics to publish some of it and to work with you on this, which will continue, obviously. And for those who want more information on this, I want you to go, at least to begin with, to the Center for Politics website, which is simply centerforpolitics.org, centerforpolitics.org, and click on the crystal ball and simply enter Project Homefire in your search, and you will get all of the pieces of outstanding research that they've already done for the crystal ball, and we will continue to have these. I apologize to both of you because this is just skimming the surface of the great work you've done in trying to find ways to bring the country back together. And you deserve a lot of credit and all the praise we can give you. Thank you so much for working with the Center for Politics and the University of Virginia and continuing to do so.
Thank you, Larry.
Now, you'll remember my next guest, I think, you should, as the whistleblower in President Trump's White House, who submitted in 2018, what at the time was an anonymous op-ed to the New York Times criticizing President Trump. Boy, was he on target. His name is Miles Taylor. Since then, he's formed an organization called the Renew America Movement, the Renew America Movement. Miles and his colleagues are working together across party lines to shift the balance of power in D.C. away from those who want to dismantle democracy's guardrails and back toward leaders who will put country over party. Wow. What an antiquated concept, putting country over party. That's how we survived for a couple hundred years. Tonight, Miles is going to be sharing with us a new project that could play a significant role in America's current struggle. Miles, we welcome you. We thank you for working with us. We're looking forward to working with you. Please tell us about this new project.
Yeah, Larry, great to be with you. First, I'd be remiss if I didn't say you guys have had some great panelists on tonight. Tara was terrific, and Mary Trump and the rest of that panel. And also, I can't emphasize enough what you said about the Project Homefire team. Really encourage folks to go take a deeper look at their work. They're doing extraordinary work and really digging into the sort of cross-sectional analysis of what divides us right now. So I really applaud you for that and for advancing their efforts. And I think what we're getting ready to launch really echoes what a lot of those panelists said and echoes some of the research we've seen from the Project Homefire team and amplifies it, hopefully. What we would like to do is fill a gap that we see out there. Now, we launched Renew America Movement to be an effort to restore a common sense coalition in our politics. And that's not just on the center right, which a lot of the folks that formed our organization are former Republican senators, governors, congressmen, cabinet secretaries, but also to reinforce the unifying and pragmatic voices on the center left. So, this election cycle on the 501c4 side, we're going to be going out there and defending those folks that form what we think is a common sense coalition at the center of our politics, both Republicans and Democrats and some independents. But this project is focused more on education and making sure that voters understand what's happening in the electorate and what candidates are out there. And the gap that we have seen is that first, we've got a whole lot of radical candidates running for office this cycle, but there's really no organization out there that's systematically tracking them and educating voters, not telling them which way to vote, but letting them know what's happening with the candidates for federal office and state office. So today we're announcing a project called The Rise of the Radicals. It's a project that would research, find, and catalog some of these more extreme candidates and really give voters a deeper understanding of the political discord in our public discourse. So that's something that we want to take a look at. Now, how are we defining radical candidates, Larry? What we're really looking at is people who believe in major conspiracy theories like QAnon, individuals who subscribe to debunked notions that the previous election was stolen, and other individuals who advocate for political violence. I mean, those are the types of people we're going to be categorizing. And I can preview some of those numbers for you tonight, but happy to take other questions.
I want you to preview those numbers. This is very interesting, and it's going to be something that the entire political community will want to know about. Please do.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, a couple of things, Larry, that really jumped out at us. I mean, as we've started this project, one of the really stunning figures, and others have come to similar conclusions, is that we've got 24 individuals who participated in the January 6th insurrection in some way, shape, or form that are running for public office this year, right? Some at the federal level, some at the state level, but that's at least 24 individuals that were there that day in Washington, D.C., some of whom actually stormed the U.S. Capitol, who rather than learning from that day that they should be on the receiving end of public shame, their takeaway is instead that they should seek public office. So that's a concern for us. We think that the public should know about those individuals, but unfortunately, it as a badge of honor, which is, I think, another indicator of really the division in this country, is that people would wear that as a badge of honor when running for public office. So that's one data point. Another that I would point out that's a little bit shocking is so far we found that there are at least 50 QAnon connected individuals running for federal office. These are primarily people running for Congress who are either avowed QAnon subscribers or regularly share QAnon related content. 50 individuals running for Congress, and these aren't all fringe people who have no chance of winning. Some of these, Larry, and we can get into some of the anecdotes, are candidates who are in the lead right now in their races or are close to being in the lead in their races. The final one that I'll touch on before we jump into a little bit more conversation is we've got 75 or more candidates for federal office right now running for Congress who believe that the 2020 election was stolen from Donald Trump and that the election was rigged. 75 people running for Congress. So our concern is, of course, right now we've got people in the Congress who are elected leaders that are very unconstructive members of Congress, people like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Paul Gosar and others. We would like to hope that in the midterm elections, we will see fewer of them and we'll see the pendulum swing back towards the center. But the trend lines we're tracking right now when we look at these races are actually the opposite. I mean, if the election were held today, we do think we would see more of these fringe conspiracy promoting candidates elected to Congress than fewer. And that's our concern, and that's why we want to launch this public education project.
This would be very useful, to say the least. I'm shocked at the numbers that you've just suggested about QAnon supporters and others who have these crazy theories about the 2020 election and probably lots of other things. The last thing America needs is more Marjorie Taylor Greenes in Congress or Paul Gosars. So what you're doing, I think, is very, very important. What percent, you mentioned that some of them were potentially viable or could potentially win. What proportion of them are in districts where, if they get the Republican nomination, they're elected?
Well, that's a really good question. And that's one of the other things that we're going to be doing ongoing analysis on is to, educate voters in key districts. Look, if this individual wins the primary, they've got X percentage chance of winning in the general election. Now, I'll give you a couple of examples of people that are likely in that type of situation. You've got someone like Ron Watkins. For folks that are familiar with that name, he is believed in some quarters to be the man behind the QAnon conspiracy theory. He is currently running for Congress in the 1st District in Arizona against Tom O'Halloran. And, Ron Watkins, if he wins the Republican nomination, has a decent chance of winning the general election. That would be absurdly disconcerting to have the potential founder of the QAnon movement actually serving in Congress. And there's no other way to think of this than the fact that we have insurrectionists who tried to storm the Capitol a year ago, and now they're trying to get elected and attack the Capitol from the inside. So, that's one person that's of concern. Another is Lauren Culp, who had previously run for governor in Washington state and contested the legitimacy of that election, even though he lost by 500,000 votes. He's now running for Congress in Washington state's 4th congressional district against a Republican. If he wins in that primary, there's a good chance he could win in the general election. This is a guy who has said that the election was stolen. He calls himself a socialist slayer, uses a lot of violent imagery and rhetoric, but potentially could be a mainstream, leading candidate in a key congressional election. But, we can go down the list. There's a whole host of folks, and some that are backed by relatively well-known people. Blake Masters is running to challenge Mark Kelly, a unifying Democratic senator from Arizona, for his Senate seat. Blake Masters, has been one of the biggest proponents of the notion that the election was actually stolen from Donald Trump, and he's being backed by, billionaire Peter Thiel. So, these are not people who are trying to scrape together cash from the couch cushions. Some of them are being backed, again, by billionaires and major super PACs. So that's something we want to make people aware of in the primaries, well before we get to the general election, where there's the possibility that some of them could be elected to Congress.
And that is so important. And many people who organize in politics and haven't had much experience don't understand you have to start at the primary level, because unfortunately, our system no longer creates many competitive districts. The vast majority of elections are decided by the balance of red versus blue, Democratic versus Republican in each of the districts, or even states. Getting the Republican nomination for Secretary of State in more than half the American states is tantamount to election. So what you're doing is extremely important. I hope that you will stay in close touch with us and with the Crystal Ball team that I have, very interested in your analyses of these elections. And more information is better. The more information that we can distribute, whether people accept it or reject it, the better off we're going to be. And that's what you're in, the information business. So I salute you for the steps you've taken and the courage that you've shown, and we look forward very much, Miles, to working with you. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Thanks, Larry, and big thanks to the Center for Politics. You guys are doing incredible work, and to UVA. Much appreciated.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it, Miles. All right, next. This is an exciting evening. I'm learning a lot myself. Next, we have Jonathan Karl, another good friend, and I've taught his daughter, and she made very high grades. I don't think John made grades that high, but he is ABC News chief Washington correspondent, and he is co-anchor of course, This Week with George Stephanopoulos, where he's done wonderful reporting about Trump for years and about January 6th. He's also the former president of the White House Correspondents Association. He is author of the New York Times bestseller, Front Row at the Trump Show, which came out in March 2020, and it really is very interesting. It had a lot of new information that I'd never come across, even about what happened in Charlottesville. So it's well worth reading. But his latest book is what you have to order tonight. Go to Amazon.com or any of the online services. His latest book is Betrayal. And I hope his subtitle is true, The Final Act of the Trump Show. I fear you're going to have a sequel, the way things are going, John, but we hope not. That also is available online and through all the various bookstore outlets. John also is going to be joining me in February to discuss Betrayal, and we're looking forward to that too. John, yesterday, ABC released an article by you that I found very interesting, and I would encourage people to go to the ABC News site and read this and see your video. You titled it, Beyond the Insurrection, January 6th was a dangerously close call. How Trump's plot nearly succeeded. First, I want you to talk about that. Tell us how it nearly succeeded beyond the riot of January 6th. And I want to get second, after you answer that, your perspectives on what's going to happen. What's going to happen with the January 6th committee to the extent you know, and what's going to happen with the DOJ, the Department of Justice? Are they going to swing into action? Are we going to get a grand jury? Have I asked you enough questions in a row? Now you know how guests feel on your shows. Go ahead, John.
Yes. Well, first of all, let me just clear something up right away. My daughter Anna, who I believe has aced every class she has taken at UVA over 3.5 years, is a much better student than I ever dreamed about being. So let's just get that.
It's your wife.
Get that clear. Yes, I mean, I don't know where it came from. It's unbelievable. But look, one of the themes of betrayal, it was not, frankly, a theme as I started writing the book, but as I started reporting, became clear to me was that it was a much closer call. That Trump's scheme, his plot, which was far broader than anything that actually happened outside in the Capitol grounds here on January 6th. It's beyond, the assault on the Capitol itself. It's not really about that. It's about his effort to overthrow a duly elected president-elect, Joe Biden, to overturn the results, certified results of a presidential election. And there were a number of places along the way where, if it weren't for the actions of a few individuals, I think things could have been much worse. And what I wrote about yesterday was the most significant moment. And it was something that I had a conversation with Michael Ludwig, who I know you know, is a prominent conservative, a jurist, highly respected among conservatives. One of his former clerks was a guy named John Eastman, who authored one of the memos coming up with this cockamamie scheme for Mike Pence to overturn the election when he presided over the joint session on January 6th. He advised Mike Pence, Ludwig advised Mike Pence that he had no such authority, he had no choice, that he had to simply open the ballots and count them as they were sent in from the states. But I spoke to Ludwig, a chilling conversation, frankly, Larry, where I asked him a question that I've been asking a lot of people as I wrote the book. What would have happened if Pence actually tried to do it? We can understand, we can agree that the Constitution didn't give him the authority to single-handedly overturn the results of an election where millions of voters cast their ballots. But and that's certainly Ludwig's view, and that's what he advised Pence at the time. But he said that here's the rub. If he had tried to do it, it's clear that he didn't have the authority to do it, but it's not clear who would have had the authority to stop him from doing it. And Ludwig says this would have cast our country into a state of chaos. Maybe a simple answer. Some people have kind of said, oh, well, we just would have gone to the Supreme Court and they would have knocked it down. But wait, how does the Supreme Court take this up? It's not clear that the Supreme Court has any role in this. The Constitution outlines a process for solving disputes over electoral ballots that focuses on the Congress. With Pence presiding, it makes no mention of the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court is generally stayed out of matters, disputes between the branches. So, look, he says that we could have been in a case where you truly did not know who the certified president of the United States was when January 20th rolled around, and said it could have done irreparable damage to our democracy. So that's one moment. Mike Pence, there had been no more loyal vice president in the history of the vice presidency. He had never defied Trump on anything. And there was no guarantee that he was going to defy him on this. But he did, despite enormous pressure. The chilling question is, what if he hadn't?
And he at least, I don't know whether he considered it or not, but he did talk with former Vice President Dan Quayle about whether he could or not. And I think he discussed this with other people. Now, maybe Pence was always leaning against violating the pro forma nature of that ceremony. But as you say, suppose it was someone else who was even more loyal to Donald Trump. Isn't that really the opening potentially for the declaration of martial law, the seizing of voting machines? And I'm not making this up, by the way. It was discussed by some of Trump's closest advisors as possibilities for them to carry out to keep Trump in office. Trump would say, well, we don't know what's going to happen. I'll just stay here for the time being until we work this out. And we probably wouldn't have worked it out until 2024. It's enough. John, 4 years ago, not 4 years ago, 1 year ago tonight, seems like 4 years. 1 year ago tonight, we interviewed you right after the end of the insurrection. And you're time-tested, you're battle-hardened, but you were shaken. You were shaken. So were some other people we talked to. And I think you were at the White House then, and you were getting ready to go over to Capitol Hill. So this was real, and people need to understand this. It wasn't a demonstration, a little protest, a tour. Some of the things that have been used to describe the insurrection really are shocking. But let me ask you this. Given everything you know about the people in charge, not just the military, but other parts of the government at the end of Trump's term, if a Vice President Pence or a more loyal Vice President Pence had gone along with Trump's scheme, what would have happened? Would we really have had a military coup? What would have happened?
Well, look, one thing that happened right after the election, and I write about it extensively in Betrayal, is literally the Monday after the Saturday where the networks declare Biden the president-elect, there is a decapitation of the leadership at the Pentagon. Mark Esper, who had resisted the Insurrection Act, was out, replaced by Chris Miller. Kash Patel, who had been a total Trump loyalist, would do anything for him, was installed as the chief of staff at the Pentagon. Others were the undersecretary for policy, the undersecretary for intelligence were fired and replaced by people who were believed to be, or put in those jobs because they were believed to be totally and thoroughly loyal to Donald Trump. Now, obviously, you had Mark Milley at the Joint Chiefs, who was not going to go along with something like this, but you had a civilian leadership that had just been installed, frankly, as I outlined in Betrayal, with the belief that those that installed it, that they would do what Trump wanted them to do, or Esper hadn't. So I think those are really difficult questions. Look, it's not just Pence, and I outlined this in some detail. Bill Barr, another person who had been seemingly totally loyal to Donald Trump. Trump demanded that Barr use the instruments of the Justice Department to overturn the election, seizing voting machines, declaring that the election was illegitimate. Barr refused to go along, and as soon as Barr left in December, he pressured Acting Secretary Jeff Rosen to do the same thing. And then when Rosen refused to do it, he tried to get somebody else in there. One of the good things, and there's no guarantee this will happen again, but one of the hopeful things is that when Trump tried to finally fire Rosen, get rid of another attorney general, the entire civilian top-level leadership at the Justice Department made a pact they would all resign en masse if Trump tried to do that. And Trump ultimately saw that it wouldn't work because the Justice Department would be decimated. So he had to back down. But he tried all of these things, and there were a few people you wouldn't necessarily think would have been the profiles and courage to take on Donald Trump. People like I just mentioned, Tim Pence and Barr, who saved this from being much worse. But he asked the Department of Homeland Security I write about to seize voting machines. Johnny McEntee, his enforcer, who I write about extensively, also called over to the acting Secretary of Homeland Security and said, "We're really upset. Why haven't you seized the voting machines?" I mean, Michael Flynn, who was visiting the White House, was openly talking about martial law. This was a really tenuous situation, and it was not just about tourists in the Capitol. And those were not tourists, obviously, but as horrific as that assault on the Capitol was, and it was horrific, that wasn't the biggest crime that took place on January 6th.
John, one of the lessons that I got out of your book, and we often forget this because we think only a handful of people run everything, and that's because we focus on that handful every day to make sense out of government for people. But one lesson I learned from your book is never to forget people who are unknown. They may have some power. They may be in the third level or the fourth level or whatever level they're at. They're not at the top. They really are the ones, along with Mike Pence, who didn't go along with Trump's scheme. They're the ones who saved the republic in this particular instance when Trump was pushing for what in essence boiled down to a coup d'etat, a self-coup. And it's a great book. I want people to get it if they haven't already, and I look forward to our conversation coming up in February about it. And John, I just have to say, as somebody who follows you pretty closely and watches you on the various shows, you've done a great job in trying to find out the truth of what actually happened before January 6th, on January 6th, and afterwards. And this is a critical time period in American history that we're going to be thinking about for as long as we live, and historians will be writing about 100 years hence. I salute you, John.
I totally agree.
Thank
you, Larry. Hey, look, it's an honor to be here with you, and I've admired your work for a long time. And I look forward to getting down to Charlottesville to seeing you in person.
I look forward to your being down here, and you're right, I have been here for a long time. 51 years. I've been here longer than you've had years. Anyway, John, you're terrific. Thank you for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, sir.
All right, now we have, I think, a very interesting panel of two. They both are connected to the University of Virginia, I'm delighted to say. Christopher Krebs, is another resident scholar at our UVA Center for Politics. And he did a wonderful job, just an absolute first-rate job at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, C-I-S-A, in preparing for the 2020 election. By all credible accounts, Chris helped to produce the safest and most secure election in modern times, trained in the honor system here at Mr. Jefferson's University. As a reward for Chris's outstanding performance, President Trump fired him on Twitter. He didn't want to hear anybody say that it was a safe and secure election, which it was. He recently co-chaired a study with the Aspen Institute, and the study was on disinformation in America, a frightening subject, something we're all going to have to think about more. And he did it with award-winning journalist, and as I mentioned, UVA grad Katie Couric, and civil rights leader Rashad Robinson. Let me add a few notes about Katie Couric. She's an award-winning journalist and #1 New York Times best-selling author of her new memoir, Going There, which is a terrific book. You've always knocked my books out of the #1 spot, Katie, and I'm just curious. I haven't had one, don't worry about it. And this was published in October 2021, so it's a very new book, and you need to go to Amazon and get that too, Going There. She's also a co-founder of Stand Up to Cancer. Her sister, who was our state senator here in Charlottesville, Emily Couric, died of a disease that's claimed many members of my family, pancreatic cancer. She raised more than $700 million for cancer research. Katie, we love you. I also need to say you were the first woman to solo anchor a network evening newscast. You served as anchor and managing editor of the CBS Evening News from 2006 to 2011, following 15 years as co-anchor of NBC's Today Show. And like Betty White, you must be very close to 100. How could you have done all these things otherwise?
I don't know, Larry, but you're not going to have any time to talk because my intro is so long. Meanwhile, I look like I'm in an infrared heat lamp. Chris, you must have a better ring light than I do. I don't know. My lighting is really bad, so I'm turning that off.
No, well,
is that too dark?
No, it's too dark now. Look, I told them to do that because I wanted to look better than the two of you who are much younger. And so it was entirely my fault. I apologize for that. But let me finish one other thing. Katie, you're interrupting me, interrupting you.
I'm sorry.
Katie, I told you this was going to happen.
I know, sorry.
I just want to mention one other thing. Just a few paces from here, you lived on UVA's lawn, and you were the head resident on the UVA lawn. You were in charge of the whole thing. You used to boss everybody around. And I just want people to know you've been in charge since the very beginning. And that was—
I'm very good at that.
That was the end of the 19th century. That was the end of the 19th century when you were doing that.
A friend of my mom's was getting a friend of mine, her mom was getting a tour of the lawn. And Estelle, I think was her name, she said, "Mama, these rooms are for people who have contributed a lot to the university." And she said, well, how much did Katie give? And she's like, no, it's not that kind of contribution.
Well, the idea is in the long run, yes, you will contribute a great deal,
exactly.
which you've already done. Chris, I should mention, was in my class back in the 1990s, and I've taken full credit for everything good that you have done, including running the safest and most secure presidential election in American history, for which we are all in your debt, Chris, all in your debt, and I hope everybody understands that. Okay, let's start and with the questions that we put together for you, and I believe you've also contributed to them. I've seen your final report with the 15 recommendations. I like it. Of course, we don't have time to cover all 15, but I've got a framing question. We hear an awful lot now about disinformation and misinformation. But you use the term information disorder, which is very new to me. What is that all about?
Well, I'll take a crack at that first, and then I know Chris has a lot to add. But, I looked up the definition of disorder, Larry, and it's a state of confusion. And I think disinformation and misinformation is really contributing to a national state of confusion. Misleading information, outright falsehoods are being ingested and spread with abandon, fueled by anger and algorithms. And as we saw, that really laid the foundation for so many of the events. And you look back at January 6th, 1 year ago, and this false narrative, i.e. the big lie, along with other beliefs about sex trafficking and abusing and murdering children, and those false beliefs that have been espoused by right-wing extremists, I think provided the fuel and in a weird rationale for the behavior that we saw unfold on January 6th. And so, I was very interested in being a part of this commission with Chris and Rashad and a lot of really smart people, academics and journalists and corporate leaders to try to figure out, how this is contributing to really the decay of our democracy. I know President Obama said it's the biggest threat to our democracy today. And I think he is, because it really is, creating the seeds that are fomenting all this discontent and this really aberrant behavior.
Well, the aberrant behavior, unfortunately, is a part of political life now. I don't think we're going to get rid of it easily. Chris, what would you add to what Katie has said?
Well, maybe it's the liberal arts education I picked up at Mr. Jefferson's Academical Village, but I'm kind of a management consultant at heart, and I look for frameworks everywhere. And as we were exploring the initial framing of the report, one of the kind of leaders in the field is a Dr. Claire Wardle, who is a PhD, is the executive director of an organization called First Draft. And she coined the term. And basically what it does is it provides a framing and framework for assessing the problem and informing policymakers for ensuing solutions. And the challenge here is that we typically talk about fake news, we talk about disinformation, but it's really across a spectrum of falsity and harms, and information disorder encapsulates all these things, whether it's misinformation, disinformation, malinformation. But to be clear, this is nothing new, right? This information disorder, propaganda, fake news, whatever you want to call it, has been around since the dawn of man in a common language. It's only accelerated recently due to the internet, due to the various platforms we have available. It's just the velocity and volume of information. And those that would misuse their positions of authority, influence, and in some cases, financial gains to shape the actions, behaviors, and mindsets of others. And so again, we pulled this together in the report, laid out a set of recommendations that I think can be helpful going forward for decision-making, policymakers.
Chris, if you were king for a day, and Katie, if you were queen for a day, but let's start with Chris, which two of those recommendations would you declare enacted by the great powers invested in you as king for a day?
So 15 recommendations across reducing harms, increasing transparency in platforms, and building trust in institutions. The ones that I like the most are those that build transparency in social media platforms. So required content moderation, disclosure, ad transparency, that combined with a more robust, serious take by the federal government. That's what I spent the last 3.5, 4 years now of my life doing in a government context, was addressing the information disorder, but in a haphazard, ad hoc way. We need government to take the lead. The government of France has done this, Sweden, Australia, Canada. There are government leadership examples that are out there. The US government needs to step up.
Katie, what would you add to that? I think that's very important. Go ahead.
Gosh, I mean, I hope people will read the whole report, Larry, because it's pretty complex and there's a lot in there. I think Chris is so right. You know, people were calling various government agencies, whether it was Homeland Security or the White House itself. And there doesn't seem to be, everyone was like, oh, we're not doing that. We're not really doing that. And I think the idea of getting a truly coordinated effort within the federal government is absolutely critical. There also, you know, we had sort of some short-term and long-term goals. One was on reducing harms. You know, part of it is kind of this truth and reconciliation idea, taking a clear-eyed view of history and understanding how these false narratives that we were all taught in school. You know, I did a whole hour on Nat Geo, as you know, Larry, about Confederate statues and iconography. And there's so much mythology and misunderstanding about when these statues were erected and the way we're taught in school. So like really understanding our history and how that has provided a foundation for misinformation and false narratives. That's kind of an overall view, and also media literacy. But clearly, I think the media ecosystem, as some of the panelists have discussed earlier, really needs to be reevaluated, particularly local news. And one of our suggestions is the Local Journalism Sustainability Act, which proposes federal tax credits to subsidize local news subscriptions, to focus more on local news organizations for marginalized communities. You know, local news is so important. From 2004 to 2018, Larry, 2,000 newspapers have folded. There's 65 million Americans currently living in news deserts. Local news is considered much more trustworthy for the average citizen if they have a vibrant local news outlet and no local news information that they can access. People are much more likely to run for office, participate in elections. And local news is really dying right now. And of course, you know about corporate ownership and Sinclair and what's happening there. So we really need to pay attention to local news. And that's something that we focused on in the recommendations because, you know, the media environment is so different than it was when I started out in television news in 1979, when there were 3 networks and big local news and big local and national newspapers. Now, you know, the fact that it's so fragmented, that has really had, I think, a very, you know, damaging impact on news consumers in general.
I hope the national media will do a better job of focusing on the decline of local media, because you're absolutely right. And that recommendation means a lot to the local TV stations, the local newspapers, the local radio stations. That's how most people get the news relevant to them. You know, yes, if we're invading Ukraine or the Russia's invading Ukraine, that's important, but it's what's happening here and whether we're having a foot of snow. We get that from local media more than national.
But also, Larry, they're the watchdogs on local officials and government. If nobody's keeping an eye on what they're doing, then those kinds of things can't be exposed. And it's so critical for civic engagement. I mean, I think we need to do a lot of things on the national level as well. I think that it's really a case of engagement through enragement. That's why you've seen so much commentary replace objective reporting, particularly when it comes to cable news. So I think that is really, really affecting trust in the media. And not to mention the democratization of media is a great thing. Everyone has a voice. That's a good thing. And you know, when you talk about the good old days, there were a lot of people who didn't have voices back then because it was all run by white guys. On the other hand, you know, everybody has a voice isn't necessarily a good thing because there are no gatekeepers, there are no editors, there are no fact checkers, and anybody with a computer or a digital device can spread misinformation, and it can go unchecked and then shared, and so it's a very, very vexing problem, and I think we're trying to address it. I would like to see media organizations get together and put aside their competitive nature and figure out how can we collectively increase trust in what we're doing. And I think you see a lot of organizations being more transparent, trying to help people understand who's writing the article and sort of the news gathering process. But, I think we have a ton of work to do, and that's a huge, huge challenge.
That's absolutely true. Chris, last comment to you for this segment.
Hey, look, I think that we've got a whole lot of work ahead of us here. I don't think there's a single individual recommendation in the report that would have addressed what transpired on January 6th. So really the concept here is we need to lay the groundwork to ensure that we can't see another January 6th in 22, 24, and so forth. We've got to reduce demand for information disorder. We have to create a more trustworthy environment in the information ecosystem. But ultimately, every single one of us has to decide and make a commitment as to whether we want to live in a democracy or not. And I've got some doubts right now about a few folks out there. But if the answer is yes, we want to be a democracy here in the United States, we have work to do.
A few folks or a few million? Well, I'm afraid the task is bigger than you think. But look, I just want to say as we leave, as a lifelong UVA person, I am so proud of both of you representing the University of Virginia, which you do, and making a contribution, many contributions, which you have done and will continue to do because you are both, despite what I said, Katie, young, and you have decades ahead of you. And again, we're just very, very proud to call you Wahoos. All right.
Wahoo-wah, Larry. And by the way, thank you for saying we're young, because guess what? Tomorrow's my birthday and I'll be eligible for Medicare. And I would like to slip my wrist right now.
Yeah, well, I'm 70. But I have no sympathy. No sympathy for you at all. All right. Hey, fantastic. Thank you all so much. Katie and Chris, we'll talk again soon, I hope. Thanks.
Thanks, Larry.
Okay,
Go Hoos.
thanks, Larry.
Go Hoos, that's right. All right. Last year, our next guest was not able to join us live as scheduled thanks to the insurrection because he was hunkered down in a safe room with many other members of Congress, I think mainly senators, and they took his cell phone away, as I understand it. He is, of course, a U.S. Senator from Virginia. He is the 2016 Democratic nominee for Vice President, former governor of Virginia, and a person who just loves to get in the car and take long drives. Senator Tim Kaine. Senator, it's great to see you, and next time I see you, I'm going to have a lot of oranges and cans of Dr. Pepper ready for you to take with you, just in case anything happens next time you're with us.
Larry, I would love that, but you should not accept it if I offer you a lift.
I won't, Senator. I have many good excuses, too. Thank you for that. Now, Senator, I know that you aren't on the January 6th committee, since it's a House-only committee. But you follow everything so closely, and you connect well with just about everybody in Congress, at least on the Democratic side, and I think a lot of the Republicans, too. Are you still hopeful that the committee and the Department of Justice, which has not indicated they even have a grand jury operating, can provide real justice, deliver real justice to the plotters and the perpetrators of the insurrection and the broader attempted coup d'etat?
Larry, I am, but I want to first sort of go directly at your question. I'm not on the committee because it's a House committee only. There was an initial proposal after the insurrection to do a scrupulously bipartisan, nonpartisan investigation that would be equally composed of Democrats and Republicans, where even the issuance of a subpoena to get one document or one witness would not go out unless there was a majority vote of the committee, meaning it had to be bipartisan. But every Republican in the US Senate, save 8, voted against a bipartisan, nonpartisan investigation of January 6th. That taught me something right away. That happened, I believe, in March of 2021. And it taught me that there would be a concerted effort by the grand old party to try to hide this and avoid it if they could. How tragic. But I do believe that the combination of the House committee, including some Republicans with backbone, courageous Republicans, state attorneys general, and the Department of Justice will help us both get to the bottom of January 6th, but also impose accountability. The DOJ has been slow, and that's been frustrating. But I don't like prosecutors who talk about their work in midstream and give status reports. I like prosecutors who do the job, make a determination about whether a charge or indictment is warranted. And then if they do, they use that document to speak for them rather than try to be media all-stars or freelance commentators. So I believe the DOJ is doing a job, but they're not yet ready to announce what they're going to do with some of the higher-ups. Obviously, many rank and filers from the violent attack on the Capitol have been indicted and charged.
Well, I think certainly based on everything I've seen, no one will ever accuse Merrick Garland of trying to be a media all-star. But we certainly hope there's more energy moving forward. And do you think there is, I know you don't know, but based on everything you've read and seen about the actions of our former president, our defeated former president, I'm adding the word President Biden used this morning, our defeated former president has done and is alleged to have done, do you think we'll be able to reach him, or is it going to be people at a much lower level?
Yeah, that's a good question, Larry. And again, I've got a lane that occupies me pretty full time, and so I don't want to make predictions about what prosecutors will determine, but I have a particularly a personal connection to this. I mean, I was on a national ticket for 105 days in 2016, and I spent those 105 days telling people exactly what would happen if Donald Trump was president. And not a single thing that he did surprised me. And, I think his character is destiny, and his character was extremely plain pre-2016. And so when a number of people chose him to be president, but more people sat on the sidelines and allowed him to be president. There's a lesson there as well about the fact that usually bad things don't happen without a massive number of bystanders. I just felt like, without knowing exactly how the story would end, I kind of knew the arc of the story. And so I believe there needs to be accountability. I believe there will be accountability. Will it be for him individually? Will it be for people close to him? I don't know the answer to that question. And I'm, as you know, Larry, I practiced law for 17 years. I still really believe in our legal system. I was a civil rights lawyer, often standing up in courtrooms where the position I advocated was extremely unpopular. And yet I believed that the rule of law would prevail. And I wasn't always confident that that had happened, but I was most often convinced that had happened. And I think the odds are we'll get to where we need to with this investigation. Will it ultimately end up with the president, under a charge or an indictment? I don't know. But I think the law enforcement professionals who are looking at this now, different parties, different jurisdictions, they'll follow the facts and they'll do the right thing.
Senator, I don't know if your colleagues in the Senate were included, but it's pretty clear that there were House members who assisted prior to January 6th and maybe even on January 6th with their staffers. There were staffers involved in this too, who helped the plotters who helped those who were preparing and organizing the insurrection. We know it, because the Republicans will never vote them out. They can't be expelled from Congress. They could theoretically be, but they won't be. Given the fact that Democrats have a very narrow, the narrowest possible, really, control of the Senate and House, is there anything that can be done to punish those members and staff members short of expulsion?
Larry, I suspect that senators were involved too. I mean, I don't think it was just House members. I joined a very diverse group of Democratic senators shortly after the attack in filing an ethics complaint against 2 senators. I've never done that, and I hope to never do it again, but I filed an ethics complaint against Josh Hawley and Ted Cruz for their role in leading the attack on the Arizona and Pennsylvania certifications. I worked closely with Ted Cruz. He and I came into the Senate at the same time. Josh Hawley and I went to the same Jesuit high school in Kansas City. We were many years apart because he's a younger man than me. And I don't casually join an ethics complaint. I've never filed one against anyone, but I felt like the efforts of those 2 to kind of organize the attack on the certification could not go without consequence. And so we filed an ethics complaint, 10 months ago. It has not been resolved. I'm not aware of where it is, but I do know that the Senate Ethics Committee, which is 3 Democrats and 3 Republicans, it's the one forum that is a very bipartisan forum. If there is to be accountability within the body, the Ethics Committee is the only avenue for the body to do that. There might be accountability at election time with voters, but if there's to be accountability within the body, I think the Ethics Committee is the right venue, and that's why I joined in the ethics complaint against these 2
Is that moving forward?
Reluctantly.
Is it moving forward, Senator? Is the ethics, well, you don't get any information, I guess, until they reach a decision.
Right.
But do you have any indication at all?
Thus far, I do not have any indication. And you're right, Larry, for those watching this, you know this, but others don't. Any kind of an ethics issue, it is within the committee until there's a resolution. And sometimes the resolution is a private reprimand that the public doesn't even know about. So I am not aware of the status of it, but I thought hard about it and joined the ethics complaint with other colleagues because I believe the actions of that day could not go without accountability.
You were nice enough to come to us a few days after the insurrection, once they gave you back your cell phone. It was an incredible experience that you described to us. Over the last several days, what struck me most are the recollections and how those recollections have changed among the U.S. Capitol Guards, the Metropolitan Police, and also the members of Congress who had to process the fact that there were hundreds of people who potentially, maybe actually, would have been happy to engineer their demise, to put it in a euphemistic way. You've had a year to think about it. How have you reevaluated, if at all, what happened? What is your perspective after a year on January 6, 2021?
Well, Larry, I'm really glad you asked that, because when I came to you a year ago, in fact, you and I, we were going to be doing an event on January 6th a year ago, and I had to scrap it because I was barricaded in a safe room in the Capitol complex, trying to get back to the floor to certify the election. And you're right, when I came to a few days later, I had so many emotions that were unresolved, and I've had an opportunity to think them through. In fact, I gave a speech on the Senate floor today about them. So here are a couple. One of my recollections of the confusion of the day when I was barricaded in the chamber is at one point I thought, wow, today's January 6th, it's the Feast of the Epiphany. Larry, you know, I'm a religious person, and we all have our motivations in public life, and mine is more of a spiritual motivation. And the Feast of the Epiphany is an interesting one in the Christian tradition. It's a feast about the Magi arriving at the manger and being surprised. They set out because they saw a sign that said something remarkable would happen. And then they arrived, and they were completely blown away because there was no majesty or pomp or circumstance or power. What they saw was a tiny baby born to a mother who couldn't, from a family so humble they couldn't even afford a room at an inn, laying in a manger of straw surrounded by barnyard animals. And the reason that I bring that up is that phrase, epiphany, beginning in maybe 16 or 1700, began to be used much broader than just to describe the Magi arriving at the manger. It now is used by many of us to describe a moment of intense revelation or perception about a reality that we didn't understand before. And it took me a number of months, frankly, to really grapple with it. And I will tell you one epiphany that I've had. And it was probably in the spring of 2021. I was extremely angry on January 6th. That was my dominant emotion. I had an emotion of relief that I had told my staff to stay home. Only my chief of staff disobeyed me, and that's why I love him. But everybody else followed my orders and stayed home. And I was relieved that they had stayed home and they were safe. But my other emotion, not a surprising one, was anger, but it was an anger unlike any I'd ever felt in my life. It took me months to figure out what was the source of this anger and why was it different than all other angers. And I eventually realized this was the reason it was different. I'm a white male born in 1958. Nobody had ever tried to disenfranchise me before. I was a civil rights lawyer in the capital of the Confederacy. I did voting rights work. It really mattered to me, but I was fighting to protect the voting rights of others. But for about 4 or 5 hours on January 6, 2021, I felt for a brief period of time what it was like to be disenfranchised. The attackers were trying to overturn the expressed will of 80 million people who had voted for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. And it was like, wow, this is what it feels like to be told you don't count. This is what it feels like to be told we're going to throw out your vote. This is what it feels like to be told that we don't want to include you. And I hated that feeling. Disenfranchisement is bad. The feeling that society wants to disenfranchise you is horrible. And the anger that I felt that day, I realized months later, was because, wow, for a few hours in a very privileged life, I could put myself in the shoes of people who have been disenfranchised during much of their lives or their entire lives, or people that have been disenfranchised over 4 centuries. I could briefly get a glimpse of how that felt, and it infuriated me. And it made me decide not only should no one ever be disenfranchised, but no one should ever have to suffer under the feeling that others want to disenfranchise them. So my commitment to doing something to protect voting, to protect the integrity of elections, to protect the security of the counting of votes, went from a civil rights lawyer's passion to an existential patriotic necessity. And that thought was slow to crystallize in my mind. I didn't have it when I was with you a year ago, but I'm very seized by it now.
Well, Senator, that is an epiphany. I've never heard that perspective from anyone else, and it makes sense for you. I know of your Catholic faith and background, and you and I share that. I have to say, maybe in sensing that anger, you could help others of us deal with the anger that we felt just as citizens from January 6th and the incredible anger we would feel if we ever had a successful coup d'etat, because this was a coup. I don't care what anybody else says. It wasn't just an insurrection. It was on that day, but it was part of a broader coup d'etat. I only hope, and I think this is true of everybody who thinks about this and isn't committed to one particular deranged individual. I just hope that as this committee studies and does its work and makes its report in the 10 months it has available to it, probably before it's shut down, that there's a way to convince people that we can't do this in the United States. This is not the way it should be, not now, not ever, because if we don't, it's easy to see 2024 turning into a complete disaster, a total meltdown. Do you have those fears too, as we wrap up?
I do, Larry. I have those fears. And, you know, I think one of the perspectives that I bring to this is I lived in a military dictatorship. You know, I think most Americans, thank goodness, have lived in this system and taken this system for granted and maybe unaware of the dangers and unaware of the way people live all over the world. But I was a missionary in Honduras in 1980 and 81. And Honduras was a military dictatorship where the military had seized power and folks with machine guns patrolled the streets, and people that I knew, if they spoke out against the government, were jailed, and some that I knew were even killed. Years after I left Honduras, a couple of people that I got to know, Jesuit priests there, were killed because of advocating for the least of these against the brute force of a military dictatorship. So I've seen the way a lot of people live in this world. And it makes me passionate about protecting what we have and shoring it up. And I really do believe, I mean, the events of January 6th were an epiphany for me in that they revealed to me the fragile nature of our democracy and democracies around the world. It was a stress test of our democracy that we barely survived but haven't yet passed. It's a stress test that is ongoing. And I told my staff this morning, I sent them a note and I basically said, look, I had a sense of relief last year in the middle of the chaos that I had told you not to come to work because I was worried about your safety. I was also worried, though, about whether if you did come to work, your public interest and patriotic motivation would be diminished or demoralized. And I hope that that's not the case, because your country needs you now more than it's ever needed you. Our country needs us now more than it's ever needed us, at least in my lifetime. And I hope we're up to the task. I don't know what the odds are, but I hope we're up to the task.
Well, as John F. Kennedy said in his inaugural address, it's a long twilight struggle, and it's not going to be resolved quickly, just as the confrontation between the East and West, or Soviet Union and the US, was resolved in the 50s and 60s. But it's one we have to win, just as we won the Cold War. We've got to win this Cold War, or maybe hot war, in the United States. Senator, I'm going to stop because otherwise your staff will never answer my calls again. And I want to thank you, not just for being with us, though I certainly want to thank you for that. I want to thank you for the thoughtful service that you give to your position and to the country. It's always worth listening to you. It's always worth reading what you write. It's always worth paying attention to your speeches on the floor of the Senate. And it's a privilege for us to have you tonight, and Godspeed. Godspeed, and I hope you can get these things done for us and nudge the Department of Justice along.
Larry, I'm really happy to be with you. If you're asking, I'm saying yes. So it's great. It's great to be with you. Thanks so much for doing this tonight.
Thanks a million, Senator. Take care and say hello to the family.
I'll do it.
Okay. All right, we've got one more guest, and a very special guest that I think you will want to listen to carefully. This is Congresswoman Liz Cheney from Wyoming. Some of you may have noticed earlier today, Congresswoman Cheney and her father, former Vice President Dick Cheney, were the only two Republicans who appeared on the floor of the House of Representatives during the moment of silence for the police officers who died as a result of January 6th. So we're going to talk about what it all means after we talk to Congresswoman Liz Cheney. This was recorded a few days ago because, as you can imagine, as one of only two Republicans serving on the January 6th committee, and as vice chair of that committee, and as somebody who's shown a tremendous amount of courage She's very much in demand this week, and particularly on this day. And we were delighted that she could spare a little time for us earlier in the week. And now let's go to Congresswoman Cheney in that final interview. Our final guest this evening truly has the courage of her convictions. And that's sometimes hard to find in politics. Congresswoman Liz Cheney serves as Wyoming's lone member in the U.S. House of Representatives. She was first elected in 2016, and she is unquestionably a conservative Republican, at least as we used to understand the term. Congresswoman Cheney has fearlessly stood up for her beliefs, and she's been willing to pay a price for her principles. From 2019 to 2021, Congresswoman Cheney served as the chair of the House Republican Conference, the third ranking Republican in the House of Representatives. But the position was taken away from her simply because she refused to back the big Trump lie about election fraud in 2020, and because she refused to back off her criticism of the former president's initiated January 6th insurrection. Fortunately for all of us, she agreed to serve as the vice chair of the Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol, which is why she is here with me now. Congresswoman Cheney, let me start by thanking you most sincerely for giving a wonderful example to young people everywhere about integrity. It's a pleasure to speak with you today, and thank you again.
Thank you very much, Larry. It's wonderful to be with you, and thank you for everything you do, and thank you for your commitment to the young people of this country and to our democracy. Really my honor to be with you.
Well, it's believe me, the honor's all mine, but thank you for saying that. Congresswoman Cheney, I've heard you frequently use an arresting and very important sentence in reference to January 6th. You've said, quote, "This is the moral test of our time," unquote. Can you elaborate on that and explain to our audience why?
Well, I think it certainly is. And I think you have to begin with recognition that the blessings that we have, the privilege that we have, that we get to live in a constitutional republic with a democratic form of government is incredibly rare. We take it for granted sometimes, but you know, most people in most parts of the world throughout most of history have not gotten to choose their leaders or have impact and input into the laws that govern them. And so you have to begin with that. And then you have to really recognize the extent to which the framers understood in so many ways how important it would be for citizens of this nation to be able to put politics aside, how concerned they were about factionalism, how concerned they were. They insisted, for example, that we all take an oath. And, we take that oath in Congress. We take it every 2 years, each time the new Congress is sworn in. It's an oath we take under God, and it's an oath to the Constitution. And that is something I think that we all have to pause and reflect what that means. And I say this is the moral test of our time because it is really a test, particularly for Republicans, about whether or not we're going to put that oath and the obligations of positions of public trust that we all who are elected occupy, and those in the executive branch too, but whether we're going to put those things ahead of politics and ahead of what might be beneficial for our particular political party at any given moment. And I think, that's the real question. We have to be willing to face directly what happened, and we have to be sure that we do everything in our power to ensure it never happens again and to hold people accountable.
You just said, Congresswoman, that this applies especially to Republicans right now in this circumstance. And I have to ask you, as somebody who has studied politics since the 1960s, what in the world has happened to the Republican Party, which used to be, at least in my mind, I think in the public mind, as a party of constitutionalists that cared about the Constitution, that thought about what it meant, tried to apply it, whether you agreed or disagreed with their interpretations. How can there be just two Republicans in the House of Representatives, you and Congressman Kinzinger, willing to investigate an insurrection that directly threatened the lives of the members who are opposed to investigating it.
Yeah, it is. I guess I don't really know the answer to that. I think that on one level, we have gotten away from seriousness. We've gotten away. And look, I think it's true in both parties that we do not elect enough serious people anymore. We need to get back to a time when people, treated the issues where we disagree as issues, that we have a responsibility to build effective arguments about and to engage in debate about the substance of those issues, but also a seriousness about, what it means to be in these positions where you have the obligation and the responsibility to protect what we have and hand it to the next generation. And I cannot explain why there have been so many Republicans in particular over the course of the last year and a half or so, but especially since January 6th, who seem to think of themselves as bystanders in some way. I think you have some Republicans who are embracing the former president, but you have a lot more who are just hoping he will go away and who are sort of acting as though they don't have any ability or responsibility to influence the outcome. And we all have to recognize that we're not bystanders, that we do have to do everything we can to try to impact events and make sure they go in the right direction.
I've often kidded that hypocrisy is the lifeblood of politics. That's too cynical by half, at least it is for me, but it always gets a chuckle. But the Republican members of Congress with whom I've discussed this always on deep background or off the record. They don't want to go on the record, with your exception and Congressman Kinzinger and a few others. They will tell you how disturbed they are by many of the things that President Trump has done, not just with January 6th, but the way he handled the presidency in other ways. And I have watched several of them go from my session right out into a public gaggle and basically call him the greatest thing since cream cheese and sliced bread. And I understand that hypocrisy has to be a little part, at least, of politics, because you need that oil, I guess, to make the machinery work. But it really stuns me in a way that I haven't seen in all these decades. Is that something you notice in talking with members off the record?
I think that there are several things like that I would point to. I do think that, for example, if impeachment had been a secret ballot, you would certainly have had more than just the 10 of us Republicans who voted to impeach President Trump. And I think, look, some of that is something that we haven't seen in American politics in a very long time, maybe since the Civil War, and that is the threat of violence. And I think you do have members of Congress who fear for their own security and for the security of their families, and that has an impact on how they conduct themselves, and that's a very concerning thing. I also think, look, if you go back, sort of, let's say maybe the pre-Trump administration, but even just pre-January 6th. You always find in our political system, there are moments where the Republicans and the Democrats are engaged in political battle, and that's not a bad thing. And there are certainly, many, many times, I'm sure through your career, certainly mine, where you hear people say things privately they won't say publicly. I mean, part of that is, some of it is hypocrisy, but some of it is just sort of, that's how the battle works. But January 6th was the line you can't cross. And so to me, first of all, I have always tried to make clear to people that I believe that politics and public service are really honorable professions. And, being engaged in those kinds of debates it's a privilege, and it is an honor. The hypocrisy doesn't have to be there. there's certainly some people that, participate with more hypocrisy than others. We're all guilty of it at times, I'm sure. But there has to come a moment when you say, President of the United States, who tried to overturn the results of an election and summoned a mob to Washington and sent them to march on the Capitol, tried to delay the electoral vote. That's a line you just cannot cross as a nation, and that's got to be a moment where we say the normal rules of politics just can't apply.
Absolutely. The slogan that I've used with students, and we give them stickers and buttons and T-shirts, is politics is a good thing. And I've done that for decades. Believe it or not, I could once sell them on that. But it's impossible right now. And I don't think I'll even distribute them this semester. We'll wait for your committee report. Then maybe I'll have a more credible chance to convince them.
But
yes, go ahead.
I just wanted to say something. I mean, one of the things that has given me tremendous hope over the course of the last year is the young people that I talk to across Wyoming and across America, and young people who want to get involved in our process, maybe because of what's happening, because they see how high these stakes are. And look, again, I believe that politics fundamentally is about citizens influencing our government, and that it is a good thing, and it's a very important thing. And so I don't want to discourage you from distributing those. I think we need many, many young people across the country engaged and involved.
But we'll send some for free. It's not a contribution. They're not worth much. So we'll send some to your office. And I agree with you. That's the source of idealism in my life for a long time, has been young people and how they react to government and how they're pushed by their internal mechanisms to one position or another. It's more based on idealism than anything else, which is not always true of adults. Yeah. With all the roadblocks being placed in the committee's way by the former president and many of his associates, and given the fact that if Republicans take control of Congress in November, not effective obviously until early January, and probably they will, that's certainly the history suggesting they will, they'll shut the committee down. So you've effectively got a year or less. Given all the things you have to do, those critical public hearings, continuing to subpoena people and get testimony and fight the court battles and all the rest of it, do you really think that a year is enough time to make a cogent case to convince the American public of what really happened?
Well, certainly the political calendar is a reality that we have to deal with. And I think that you've certainly heard from Minority Leader McCarthy and others, they certainly are not going to participate actively, and likely will shut the committee down if the Republicans take control. We have, though, had tremendous response and outreach already on the committee in terms of the documents that have been turned over, in terms of the interviews we've conducted. Some of the interviews, as you mentioned, have been under subpoena. Some of them have been voluntary. We've had people reach out to us. And we've talked now to close to 400 people, I believe. And obviously tens of thousands of pages of documents have been turned over. So I'm confident that we will, despite the efforts that you point out of people to delay and obstruct, I'm confident that we will get to the truth, that we will get our work done. We're doing it in a way that shouldn't be unusual, frankly, but is, and that is it's very much nonpartisan. And I have just been really every single day, so impressed with the nonpartisan professional staff that we have. We have many former assistant U.S. attorneys, 2 former U.S. attorneys, some appointed by Democrats, some appointed by Republicans, and in the committee itself. And so the amount that we're able to get done, because we all are very focused on the same objective and working to make sure that that objective is met, is really impressive. So I'm confident that we'll get our work done. We're not going to, let people who are trying to delay us deter us, and we'll have, the facts and the truth to lay out for the American people.
Well, that's very reassuring to hear, and I certainly hope it turns out that way. One question I've had on my mind, actually two. One is, and I know you can't reveal things before the report is done and goes public, but have you been able to discover who financed this very expensive operation of the rally and the preparations for what happened at the Capitol, and even some events that took place prior to January 6th? And is there any indication that that money came from individuals or committees where the money was raised for other purposes, which suggests that it's even a felony?
Well, that's certainly a significant area of investigation the committee is looking at. And we have a team, multiple investigative teams, and one of those teams is dedicated specifically to the financing and to the sources of the financing, as you pointed out, where the money came from, who was writing the checks. And look, it's important. People have a First Amendment right. They have a right to support political activities. There's no question about that. I think that with respect to the fundraising that we've seen with the efforts around Stop the Steal, the fundraising efforts that the former president's been involved in, that's been part of the big lie. And if you look at the claims that were being made after the election was over, claims that involved allegations about fraud that the former president knew weren't true. He'd been told they weren't true multiple times by his own Justice Department, just as one example. But yet his so-called campaign continued to run ads making those claims and continued to raise money from people. And I think that this is certainly one of the biggest tragedies of a number of tragedies of this period, which is that, there are millions of people across the country, hardworking Americans, who have been lied out of their money by Donald Trump. And he continues to do it to this day. And it's, as I said, it's one of the things that the committee is clearly looking at. And I'm confident we'll be able to get to the bottom of a lot of that.
That's one topic I'm particularly interested in because it's fraud. The other question that I had involves members of Congress, Republicans, obviously, and even I think you suggested, I know Chairman Benny Thompson has suggested this very recently, that there were a certain number of members of the House of Representatives, maybe senators, but members of the House, who helped those who invaded the Capitol in advance. Some suggested that it was giving tours, although Chairman Thompson suggested that was not the case, but in other ways helped them along the way. Will that also be a part of the committee's report? And how extensive was this? What's your impression, understanding that the committee's investigation is far from over?
Yeah, I think we certainly are looking at all aspects of, members and others' involvement in what happened that day. That's something that is part of our ongoing investigation. So I don't want to say too much about sort of conclusions in that regard. But one thing that's important to remember is that these efforts to delay the count, were efforts that were underway, both with respect to the violence that we saw on the 6th, but also just the efforts to delay themselves. And so I think that, you've already seen the committee issue letters to 2 members With respect to Representative Perry, his involvement around President Trump's determination to appoint Jeff Clark as the Attorney General is something that we're very interested in. And the communications that he had with respect to that effort. And that's an effort that, an effort by President Trump to put in as Attorney General Jeff Clark, who would then make and amplify the claims about the stolen election that others at the Justice Department wouldn't make. It's been public that you had the entire leadership of the Justice Department threatened to resign if President Trump went through with his plan to appoint Clark as the Attorney General. And we know that Representative Perry was engaged in that effort. So there are a number of issues that we want to talk to members about.
It's interesting because this relates directly to a plot that was developed apparently after Election Day, since everything we've seen so far suggests that President Trump and some of the people around him expected him to win. And therefore, maybe it wasn't necessary to have a detailed plan in place in case he didn't. But the ad hoc nature of what took place in 2020 post-election and then early 2021 maybe was one of the reasons why the plot did not succeed. But as we've all seen, Congresswoman, there is a much clearer plan for 2024. Now, it involves the public and the voting public and whether they elect certain candidates for Secretary of State, or rather nominate certain candidates for Secretary of State in GOP primaries. What do you think can be done beyond what this report will say to short circuit any such plot in advance?
Well, I think that you're exactly right in terms of the efforts that continue. I think if you look at what happened in the days and months leading up to January 6th, you see the critical importance of a number of state and local elected officials who refused to do what President Trump was pressuring them to do, and who did their jobs, who took their responsibilities seriously. And I think that in 2022 and 2024, it's really important for voters across the country to make assessments about candidates with that in mind. And, when you have a situation like we have today, for example, in Georgia, where you've got Secretary of State Raffensperger, who, did his job and did his job without yielding to the pressure from the White House. And he's now running against Jody Heiss, who has said, essentially he will do what Donald Trump wants. And that's very dangerous. So I think that people need to recognize that there is an effort underway, beginning down at a very local level. You look at some of the endorsements you've seen President Trump make in places like Michigan, that, local level, county level, state level, in offices, to put people in place who have an allegiance to Donald Trump instead of, to the Constitution, to the electoral process and system. And I think it's important for people to recognize that that's happening, and important to make sure that we elect people whose commitment is to the democracy.
As Benjamin Franklin told us, it's a republic if we can keep it. And you're absolutely right. In the end, it comes down to us. It comes down to we, the people. And it's important for us to remember what happened and to study your report carefully once it's released. Thank you so much, Congresswoman Cheney, for taking some time for us in what is an exceptionally busy week for you. And on behalf of all of us, good luck and Godspeed to you and your committee.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you very much for having me. And again, thanks for everything you do. And to all of the young people who are watching, just know you can make a difference, and we need you to make a difference. Every individual can, and in this country, every individual has a duty to do that. So, please get involved and help make sure that we can hand this constitutional republic off to our next generation as well. Thank you very much.
That's the right message for the right audience. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
It's great to hear someone like Congresswoman Cheney, when you realize what a profile and courage she is and how she has already been penalized for being honest and truthful and holding to her principles. You can only have great respect for her, whether you agree or disagree with her party ID or her voting record. It's pretty remarkable to see someone of her stature do what she has done. So in closing, one thing January 6th taught all of us is that we can no longer take for granted the democratic republic we once assumed was secure. When hundreds of white supremacists and neo-Nazis can rampage through Charlottesville and just outside on the lawn of the University of Virginia, and many hundreds of insurrectionists can invade the U.S. Capitol at the direction of a president trying to cling illegally to power, beating up police, threatening to hang the Vice President of the United States and the Speaker of the House, and on and on. We'd all better wake up and take this deadly seriously. We need to join together to try hard to prevent anything of the kind of January 6th we saw a year ago from happening again. I want to thank all the wonderful guests that we had joining us tonight, and thank you for spending time with us, listening to our speakers. And I want you to know, we at the UVA Center for Politics and others at the University of Virginia intend to continue to focus on this essential topic in future months and also future years, not because we enjoy focusing on it, but because to fail to do so is to encourage people who are hell-bent on stealing elections and democracy itself in the United States of America. We can't let them win. Good night and have a healthy new year.